Sally Field, so often seen as America's sweetheart, has finally spoken, and what she just revealed about Burt Reynolds changes everything. For decades, Burt told the world she was the love of his life. He made it sound like a storybook romance, a woman he cherished, a mistake he regretted, a love that never faded. But it wasn't the truth, because while Burt was charming the public, Sally was carrying the truth alone. She let him lie for 40 years, and when she finally told her side, it stunned everyone. It was 1977, and America had a new obsession. Smokey and the Bandit had just hit theaters, and its stars, Sally Field and Burt Reynolds, seemed like the perfect pair. He was the ultimate leading man, rugged, confident, impossible to ignore. She was smart, quick-witted, and radiant on screen. And together, they were magnetic. Audiences didn't just watch them fall in love. They believed in it. They wanted it to be real. And for a moment, it was. Behind the scenes, Sally and Burt had begun a real-life romance during filming. And for a woman like Sally, who had been underestimated for most of her early career, it felt like a validation. She had grown up in the shadow of a complicated home life, pushed into the spotlight as a teenager, and dismissed by Hollywood as a girl next door, with a sweet smile but not much else. So when Burt Reynolds, arguably the biggest star in the world at the time, chose her, it felt like a kind of triumph. But that was the illusion. In her own words, Sally would later describe the beginning of their relationship as confusing. He wasn't cruel, not at first. He was funny, charismatic, generous, and yet, there was something under the surface, something sharp, something controlling. He liked her, but more than that, he liked how she fit beside him. The way she made him look, the softness she brought to his hard edges. She later said, "He liked the image of me more than he liked me." Burt didn't want an equal. He wanted an ornament, and Sally, still trying to define her own self-worth, gave in to it. At first, it was subtle. He'd nudge her away from certain projects, suggest what she should wear, how she should speak in public, how she should navigate her growing fame. She didn't fight back, not because she agreed, but because she didn't yet know she could. It was the late 1970s. Women in Hollywood still walked a tightrope between being adored and being dismissed. And Sally was determined to be taken seriously, not just as a girlfriend or a pretty face, but as a real actress. So she stayed, and she smiled, and she let people believe what they wanted to believe. Publicly, the relationship seemed electric. They did more films together. They laughed in interviews. They showed up on red carpets arm in arm. But privately, Sally was shrinking. He overshadowed her. He made her feel small. And the more she pulled away, the more he tried to hold on. By the time she won her first Oscar for Norma Ray, Sally was stepping into her own power, but not without consequence. The stronger she became, the more Burt tried to pull her back into the version of their relationship he controlled. It wouldn't last forever. Eventually, she left. But when she did, she didn't explain why. She didn't go public with the pain. She didn't expose the emotional toll. She just walked away. And Burt, he told his version, loudly, repeatedly, for 40 years. When Sally Field left Burt Reynolds, she didn't do it with a press release or a headline. There were no interviews, no public heartbreak. She simply disappeared from the narrative. And Burt filled that silence. He told the world she broke his heart, that he had messed up, that she was the one that got away. He spoke of her with longing, as if she had been the great love of his life. And people believed him because they wanted to. But behind that narrative was a woman who had learned to survive by staying quiet. Sally Field didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she was slowly being erased. At the height of their relationship, Burt Reynolds was the Hollywood icon. He was everywhere, films, television, magazines. And Sally, despite being a powerhouse in her own right, often found herself in his shadow. She wasn't naive. She knew that being with Burt elevated her profile, but it also chipped away at her identity. In private, the dynamic was very different from the smiling photos. Sally has since revealed that Burt could be dismissive, sometimes cruel. He criticized her body, her insecurities, her instincts. He didn't want her to challenge him. He didn't want her success to outshine his. And yet, she stayed. Because for women like Sally, who came of age in the industry during the 1960s and 70s, leaving wasn't so simple. She had spent her early career trying to be taken seriously, fighting against roles that painted her as sweet, soft, and silent. Now, with a man like Burt beside her, she was being asked to be all those things again. And she complied. Not out of weakness, but out of survival. She wrote in her memoir, "I felt I had to hide so much of myself to make the relationship work. He made her feel like the more she gave up, the more he'd love her. And it worked. For a while. Until it didn't. Even as she racked up accolades, an Emmy, an Oscar, Sally found herself questioning her worth. She had everything. And yet she felt invisible in her own life. She admitted later that she would second-guess her decisions, censor her voice, and suppress her instincts just to avoid upsetting Burt. And when she finally walked away, she didn't do it to make a statement. She did it quietly, because there was no space for her voice in the story he had built. She didn't call him out. She didn't try to reclaim the narrative. She let him talk. Let him paint himself as the romantic hero. Let him say whatever he wanted to say. And in doing so, she protected herself, but also protected him. For 40 years, Burt Reynolds repeated the same story. That Sally Field was the one he loved the most. That he wished he'd done better. That he was sorry. It sounded noble. It made him human. It made fans love him even more. But Sally knew the truth. In her own words, "By the time I walked away, I had almost nothing left of myself. I had to leave. If I didn't, I don't know who I would have become." Her silence wasn't an act of love. It was a defense mechanism. And it worked until she no longer needed it. She stayed silent for 40 years. Not because she couldn't speak, but because she knew no one wanted to hear what she had to say. Not then, but that was about to change. Once Sally Field quietly walked away, Burt Reynolds stepped forward, eager to tell the story his way. And for 40 years, no one questioned it. He painted himself as the wounded lover, the man who let the best thing in his life slip away. In interviews, he was charming, playful, sometimes regretful, sometimes nostalgic, but always in control of the narrative. He told Barbara Walters in 1986, "Sally was the love of my life. I screwed it up." And with that single line, he earned America's sympathy. People didn't ask what happened behind closed doors. They didn't wonder why Sally never responded. They assumed the silence meant agreement, that she was the one who left a good man behind. And in a way, Burt knew exactly what he was doing. Every time he told the story, he added a little more romance and left out just enough reality. He said they had drifted apart, that fame got in the way, that he had been immature and she had been too ambitious. But what he didn't say, what he never admitted, was how much power he tried to exert over her life. How he'd critiqued her body, told her she wasn't funny enough, dismissed her as too emotional, pressured her to take roles that made him look good, even if they damaged her career. None of that was in Burt's version. And since Sally never contradicted him, the world believed it. For decades, Burt's carefully curated heartbreak became part of his brand. A man who'd loved too deeply, a man who still missed her, a man who, late in life, was finally softening. It was disarming, and it made great TV. What no one realized, what no one wanted to realize, was that his version of events kept Sally small. Even in her absence, she remained the woman in his shadow. Whenever she achieved something, an Oscar win, a critically acclaimed role, he'd be there in the media, reminding everyone that he had loved her first, that he had made her who she was, that she was, at the end of the day, his heartbreak. It was subtle, but it was effective. Fans would write about how tragic it was that they didn't end up together. They'd ask Sally in interviews if she still loved him. They'd call it one of the greatest love stories in Hollywood. But for Sally, it wasn't love. It was survival. And for 40 years, she carried the burden of a story she never got to tell. When she finally broke her silence in 2018, it wasn't with a scandal or a headline. It came in the form of a memoir, in pieces. And in that book, for the first time, Sally pulled back the curtain. She described their relationship as emotionally destructive. She revealed that Burt had demanded loyalty, obedience, and silence, that he mocked her insecurities, undermined her confidence, dismissed her ideas, and most of all, that he made her feel small, even as the world saw her as a rising star. She wrote, "I was relieved when it ended. I knew I'd never find myself in that place again." The press called the revelations surprising, but they shouldn't have been. The signs were always there, buried beneath the laughter, the red carpets, the movie magic. What made them surprising was how completely Burt had owned the narrative for so long. He didn't just tell his side, he buried hers. And the world, for the most part, let him. Because who wants to believe that the charming, mustachioed movie star was actually the villain? Who wants to believe that the love of his life was quietly suffering behind the scenes? Who wants to admit that the story we were sold for 4 decades wasn't real? When Sally Field released her memoir in pieces in 2018, it didn't come with fireworks or gossip headlines. There was no bitter tone, no revenge, just a quiet, deeply personal account of a life spent being overlooked, even by those who claimed to love her most. And tucked inside those pages was the truth about Burt Reynolds. For years, Sally had let the world believe his version of the story. She hadn't corrected him when he said she was the love of his life. She didn't deny it when he told interviewers he'd ruined everything and still regretted it. But that wasn't because it was true. It was because she wasn't ready to reopen those wounds. In the memoir, Sally writes about Burt with a kind of aching clarity, not anger but honesty. She revealed that their relationship had been anything but romantic. Behind closed doors, Burt Reynolds was controlling, demanding, and emotionally manipulative. He didn't hit her. He didn't scream. But he wore her down bit by bit until she no longer recognized herself. She wrote, "He was not good for me in any way, yet I stayed. Why? Because I didn't know I deserved better." She explained how he routinely criticized her appearance, her choices, even her body. He made jokes about her weight, told her she looked tired or plain, and dismissed her need for space and independence. And worse, he used his influence to interfere with her career. She described moments when he would mock the projects she was excited about, or convince her to pass on them entirely. He didn't want her to grow. He wanted her to stay still, frozen in the image he preferred. Smiling, agreeable, dependent. But Sally was evolving. She had survived a difficult childhood, a complicated family life, and a Hollywood system that constantly tried to define her. She was finally coming into her own. And Burt, whether he knew it or not, was trying to keep her small. One of the most heartbreaking passages in the book describes how, even at her most successful, Sally still questioned whether she was enough. Not because the world told her that, but because he did. "I made myself smaller just to keep the peace. And in doing so, I lost parts of myself I never got back." She didn't write these things to punish Burt. In fact, by the time the book was published, he was already gone. Sally had no reason to lie, no scandal to stir up, no image to repair. She told the truth because it was hers, because for 40 years, she'd let someone else shape her story. And for the first time, she wanted to tell it herself. The reaction was mixed. Some fans were shocked, heartbroken even. They didn't want to believe that Burt, the man who had made them laugh and cry for decades, could have been anything less than a romantic hero. Others were angry on her behalf, furious that she had suffered so quietly for so long. But most of all, people were moved by her bravery. Because Sally didn't portray herself as a victim. She didn't ask for pity. She just told the truth. And that truth was simple. Burt Reynolds was not the man she needed. He was the man who made her doubt her own voice. And when she finally found that voice again, it wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, measured, devastating. In one interview, when asked why she stayed silent for so long, Sally simply replied, "Because no one would have believed me then. They only saw him, not me." It's hard to hear, harder still to accept, but it's real, and it's hers. After 40 years of letting someone else tell the story, Sally finally took it back. Just days after In Pieces was published, Burt Reynolds passed away. The timing couldn't have been more surreal. After 40 years of silence, Sally had finally told the truth. And then, just like that, the man at the center of her most painful story was gone. News of Burt's death spread quickly. The headlines were glowing. Tributes flooded in from Hollywood. He was remembered as a legend, pioneer, a symbol of swagger and charm. And almost every story mentioned her. Sally Field, the love of his life. But Sally didn't attend the funeral. She didn't deliver a public eulogy. She didn't rush to defend him, or explain him, or soften what she'd said. She stayed quiet. For the first time in decades, her silence wasn't about protecting him. It was about protecting herself. And that, in many ways, was more powerful than anything she could have said aloud. In an interview shortly after his death, she was asked if she had any regrets. She paused, collected her thoughts, then said softly, "There are things I wish I could forget, but I remember them all." She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply told the truth again. And in that moment, it became clear. Sally wasn't trying to erase Burt. She wasn't interested in tarnishing his legacy or rewriting his story. She was just finally ready to stand beside it with her own version. Because for 40 years, Burt Reynolds had lived as both man and myth. He had been allowed to spin a story of tragic love and regret. A man who lost the woman he adored. And for 40 years, no one questioned whether that story was one-sided. When he died, the public grieved the man they thought he was. But Sally had already grieved him long before the world said goodbye. She had grieved the years she lost trying to meet his expectations. The pieces of herself she gave up to make him feel powerful. The voice she'd silenced to keep his version of the story intact. She didn't need to stand at a gravesite to say farewell. She'd done that years ago when she walked away quietly with nothing. And maybe that's why her absence at his funeral spoke louder than any tribute could. Because in a town obsessed with optics and headlines, Sally didn't perform her grief. She didn't smile for the cameras or say something sweet to smooth it all over. She stayed home. That choice, deliberate, dignified, and deeply personal, was the final act of a woman who had learned, the hard way, that some goodbyes don't need to be public. In the weeks following Burt's death, the media tried to tie Sally back into his narrative. They played old clips of the two of them laughing together, reran quotes from his interviews, and speculated about how heartbroken she must have been. But she didn't play along. She didn't say he was misunderstood. She didn't claim that time had healed all wounds. She didn't pretend it had been a great love. She let the world say what it wanted, just as she always had. But this time she wasn't silent because she was afraid. She was silent because she no longer needed to explain. In one final public statement, she said, "There are moments in your life that are indelible, that stay with you no matter how much time passes. Burt was a part of my life, but that doesn't mean I go backward." It was her way of closing the door. Not with bitterness, not with rage, but with truth. And after everything, after all the headlines, the interviews, the stories she never asked to be part of, Sally Field finally got to walk away again. Only this time, she left with her head held high. For decades, the story of Burt Reynolds and Sally Field was held up as a lost love. The roles they played in movies, the banter, the chemistry, the big smiles became part of the myth. A storybook romance that just didn't work out. But it wasn't a storybook. It wasn't even a love story. It was a warning. Sally Field didn't write In Pieces to tear Burt Reynolds down. She didn't want pity or applause. She just wanted the truth out there because for 40 years only one version had existed. And it wasn't hers. The man who told the world she was the love of his life had, in private, made her feel small. He had shaped the public narrative to suit his image. And she had allowed it because back then, she didn't feel strong enough to correct it. But that's what makes her story so powerful now. Because when she did find her voice, she didn't shout. She didn't seek revenge. She simply told the truth with grace and honesty and pain. She let the world know that behind the smile was a woman who had endured. Behind the silence was a woman who had been diminished. And behind the so-called romance was a reality no one had dared to see. And perhaps that's why it hit so hard. Because it wasn't scandalous. It was familiar. How many women from her generation or any generation know what it's like to be loved conditionally? To be adored only when they stay small, silent, and agreeable? How many women have watched the world fall in love with a man who treated them like they were invisible? Sally Field's story isn't just about Burt Reynolds. It's about power, about legacy, about the courage it takes to speak when the world has already made up its mind. And in the end, it wasn't her Oscar that gave her that courage. It wasn't fame or recognition. It was time. Time to look back. Time to gather herself. Time to finally tell the truth. Not the fairy tale. Not the headline. The truth. That Burt Reynolds lied for 40 years. That she let him. And that when she finally chose to speak, she didn't do it for him. She did it for herself. That's what makes Sally's story so unforgettable. She didn't burn everything down. She didn't try to win a fight. She just stepped out of the shadow and into the light. And this time, when she spoke, the world finally listened. For more of the latest news, check out this video.